I just wanted to say a few words of introduction. I think maybe you've all seen Richard's biography, which I think you were handed when you arrived. And so I could simply say what you can in fact read, that Richard is Director of the Behavioural and Social Research Programme at the National Institute of Ageing, one of the National Institutes of Health. And before that, he was one of the staff directors of the Federal Forum on Age-Relating Statistics. He has been a student here at Oxford and a student at Harvard. He's been on the academic board of the University of California, San Francisco Medical School, and I think has also been in the faculty at Stanford. But you can read about this. What I want to say instead is the tremendous impact that Richard has had, not only on ageing in America, where I think it is true to say that he transformed the way we understand population ageing. He set up centres of the demography and economics of ageing over the last 20 years. He was responsible for the Health and Retirement Survey. But having done that, he then started this kind of real sort of academic work out of economics and demography across the globe, and is responsible for the major ageing studies in this we have at the moment. But he's also very, very special to us, because it was Richard who I first met in 1994 at a population conference. It was Richard who came over here in '98 and very much supported the development of ageing initiatives in this country, who gave us the first money to set up the Oxford Centre on Population Ageing, and has been a tremendous supporter, both financially but also as a mentor to us. So it is fantastic to have you with us, and I'd like to invite you to give the first talk this evening. Thank you. Let me see you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I've come to collect the dividends from that initial investment. I was very impressed with what's been done, except now I realize you haven't a clue as to what's going on. You gave me 20 minutes to talk about research over the last century in aging. It reminds me a little of once I took somebody, I was very surprised that a young American girl hadn't ever been to the British Museum, and we only had 30 minutes, so I took her on a quick tour of the highlights of 3 or 4 millennia in the British Museum. Didn't do too badly since she married me, but we may not get to the Rosetta Stone today, so it'll give me some signals as time goes by. Well, I'm going to look at this through my own prism of the National Institute on Aging, which is one of the large, it's a mid-size institute at NIH. Going back in, and there's a little hubris in this, but forgive me. 1980, I think aging research was a backwater at the periphery of much of science, and social behavioral research in aging was on the periphery of the periphery. Then in 1998, Sarah arranged, I think, a fateful meeting here that helped set up the UK Health and Retirement Study equivalent called ELSA, English Longitudinal Study on Aging, which had actually a big impact on the health and retirement study, because they innovated and we then re-imported some of those innovations. And I think today aging is really much closer to the leading edge in science, and social science has become much more integrated and is central. And just to boast a little, NIA grantees have won a series of Nobel Prizes, 4 in economics, starting with Bob Fogel, Dan McFadden, Danny Kahneman, Heckman, whom we funded after he got his, so it doesn't quite count, and then several in medicine, Prusiner, Greengard, Blackburn, Graydon. I'll talk a little about telomeres in medicine. And if you want to impute cause and correlation to Sarah's meeting in 1998, I won't stop you, but I think it helped transform our world. So a few observations on changes I've seen in social behavioral research and aging. Increasingly, it's now large team science that depends on costly infrastructure, expensive longitudinal surveys, collecting biomeasures, now DNA and genotyping, which is quite expensive, although it's coming down, and expensive magnets for fMRI studies for areas like neuroeconomics. And several areas have become much more tightly integrated with the life sciences, clinical medicine, etc. And then we've been helping develop a series of new interdisciplinary fields to solve the problems, and some of these have now lost their hyphens, so I think they're almost established. There's a renewed interest in cross-national comparative studies, and I'll present some data from some of those, made possible by the new data, and increasingly we're giving thought to large-scale, randomized trials using, where we can, natural experiments, but in some cases creating our own experiments, and a lot of interest now in how observation and randomized experimental approaches fit together. Some of the trends, I mean, this is you all seen those things, the greatest hits or the golden oldies. What's happened since 1998 or so? I think aging, as Sarah said, is transforming the world, especially now the third world, and politicians in many countries have become aware of this. Less so in the low-income countries, and the question is it going to rival climate change as an important focus? I remember an MIT study which was trying to decide who had the most deleterious effect on Africa. Was it the tsetse fly or the white settlers? And it came out about even, but this is not to say that aging is negative. It's got many positives, but it does have some challenges. I think the other important finding is that non-communicable diseases are to become predominant in the entire globe sometime between 2030, 2040, maybe 2050, already so in high-income countries, but you're beginning to see high levels in places like rural Africa. Perception of aging's inevitabilities has changed significantly. Some through the work of the Jim Vorpel's group showed that life expectancy be increasing 3 years a decade in the country with the leading level of life expectancy since 1840, and shows no sign of an asymptote. I think there's now some interesting work going on at the molecular level on slowing the aging process and life extension. So we'll talk a little about rapamycin. Give it to mice, they live longer, but the question is, will they be fit in the wild or just be eaten? I mean, if you can live long but you're sleeping, you may not survive that well. Old age's disability is plastic. We saw a huge decline in the US, 25% in old age disability, but it's now being threatened by the increase in obesity. I think we also saw a discovery of pensions overriding effect on labor force supply, the work of Gruber and Wise. Some of the changes and achievements, I think, the longitudinal surveys that have spread around the world. I think we've done some interesting work on how to improve cognition in older workers and in the elderly. There's a realization, even at NIH, National Institutes of Health, which is very biologically and molecularly based, that lifestyle is a major factor in health, and we've got to find better ways to change it, and there's new science developing of looking at the basic mechanisms of behavior change, and I think some economics there is coming into play. We saw social networks rediscover Durkheim's social facts, that there's a structure out there and you can't just look at individual psyches. People are affected by other people they don't know. We saw data on stress at the cellular level, the telomeres and stress related to Liz Blackburn's Nobel Prize, and it's a measure of essentially chromosomal aging, and it seems to relate to life expectancy. We've seen advances on showing the huge effect of childhood on both health and wealth, not just David Barker, but there are a lot of other data based on representative samples, including the British cohort studies, which are treasures. And the question leaves open is there room for interventions at the adult level, middle age and old age? How much room is there? Search for a cure for Alzheimer's. There are new pathways being discovered. And then at the macro level, which working on developing national accounts equivalent to GDP or GNP, sort of what's the total health or well-being produced, and in terms of intergenerational transfers, what are the transfers across generations, and then also in terms of third world country aging, what's going to happen as China ages, and capital flows, I think, are going to be heavily dependent on pension systems. So just a few pictures of some of these things. This is the Vorpel, Open and Vorpel study showing a dramatic, you never see these straight lines in social science, the increase in life expectancy in the country, which was the leading country. Countries change. Since 2000, it's gone on linearly. It's no change at all, no sign of an asymptote. We don't know when, how old people can survive until. Before then, Vorpel and Carey had found using Mediterranean fruit flies, then Drosophila, and then C. elegans, that Gompertz's law didn't hold. It wasn't exponential, but that mortality leveled off at the highest ages and then even dipped. And there's some evidence for this in humans, so that changed our perception. Here's the rapamycin data showing treatment at 9 months. The red line is those treated. Certainly an increase. If you start at 20 months, you still get an increase, not quite as great. And the question is what pathways, and are any of them involved in humans? And if they are, what are the trade-offs? Because a lot of things you can extend life in flies, but then they're very torpid and sleep. But there's another study going on called Calorie, looking at very low caloric diets and what that does. I mean, certainly in monkeys, you get great, their fur looks much better, they're more active, and the question is what's going to happen with humans. And then since some of the chemicals really do relate to the same pathways, insulin signaling, etc. So, I mean, this is the big policy issue. You've got the extra life. They have to be financed, but it's difficult with workers to pensioners ratio shrinking. So save more, prevent Alzheimer's disease, stay healthier to work longer. There are only a few, increase productivity, import workers, and delay things. There are only a few solutions, and we're looking at the prevention of AD and staying healthier. This I find to be a dramatic picture of population aging. It's saying that in a few years, give or take some, because projections are always have uncertainty, for the first time in human history, there'll be more people aged 65 than under 5, and that's likely to be true for the rest of human history. And this is, I was going to show a clock. We had some clocks made of the number of people turning age 5 and 65. I was going to show it, but it takes so long. I mean, people turning 65 are going like this, and people turning, entering the under age 5 is slow. So there just wasn't enough time to show it, but it is dramatic. This, I think, is an important thing that came out of one of our program projects to Chris Murray at WHO, this finding that the burden of disease of non-communicable disease is by 2030, and it may be 2040, 2050, is going to be very high, and the predominant form of disease. For the most part, WHO didn't recognize this or take action until very recently. Here's some data from some of our surveys. SAGE of undiagnosed hypertension in India, Mexico, Ghana, South Africa, enormously high, enormously high. And so hemorrhagic stroke will follow, and chronic, and so just one set of examples. This was one of the major findings, certainly of the last a decade and a bit, and I think we can go back to 1998. The finding that by the Gruber and Wise group that public pension incentives determine retirement age and labor force supply in high-income countries, an enormous effect. And I think that has changed policy. I'll come back to that. Another big finding that changed our view and perception of aging was the sort of the Manton finding of decline of disability in the US of different cohorts between 84 and really 2000. It seems to have leveled off. People didn't believe it at first. The view is that you'd get an expansion of people. You couldn't prevent chronic disease. You couldn't cure it, couldn't treat it, and it would just, people would live longer. You could prevent people dying, and so you'd get an enormous increase in chronic disease. And I think that changed the world as we see it. Unfortunately, the obesity increase in the US seems to be counteracting this. If it hadn't, it would pretty well take care of baby boom aging in terms of health because of the decompounding effect. And it was a major motivation for funding ELSA, SHARE, SAGE, and In Depth. We knew nothing about the trends there. This is from the ELSA data. It shows it's not too apparent, but in terms of activity limitation, there is a reduction by cohort and a slight reduction, improvement in walking speed. We set up the health and retirement study, and I'll talk about that. Essentially, around 1990, large study, 20,000 people 50 and above, multidisciplinary now, blood, DNA, linked to administrative records, heavy emphasis now on cognition, and we're approaching 2,000 articles and publication. And I think it helped change some of the research by, in a sense, forming new scientific communities around the world and bringing together different disciplines with enough pressure and money and scientific interest and policy significance. You got the disciplines working together for the first time. So this is the SHARE, ELSA, and there's TILDA now in Ireland, and then say HRS and SAGE has really spread around the world, and more countries are joining, and one challenge is to increase the number of countries, because I think comparative analysis is really important. Here's another comparative statistic showing the huge difference, even at age 50, and you get a difference also at age 80 in life expectancy in high-income countries. It wasn't always that way. US was at the bottom now, but it was near the top around 1950, 1970, 1980, and then what happened with women? We set up a panel to look at that, and as best as we can understand it, it's a cumulative smoking effect that might change. So if you're looking at projections of mortality, not only do you want to look at education, but you also want to look at years smoked. Another big finding that came out of initially HRS and ELSA was the finding that although the Americans said their health was much better, when you actually looked at the prevalence of diseases, it was much worse. When you looked at risk factors from the bloods, glycosylated hemoglobin, blood pressure, C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, the bad cholesterol, US was doing badly. And this is only among this is whites, so it's not a race issue. But on the other hand, when you add in share, England is not doing very well compared to the rest of the continent. And the question is, what's going on? One question is it wealth? Is it SES? It's not. Here's something from Avadano showing that even at a wealth of 900,000 euros, you still have you still have quite a big difference. And when you look at stroke, I should have put stroke up. England then is in the middle, but England doesn't do too badly here. But with stroke, it's in the middle. Now, let me move to another big change. One of the hypotheses was allostatic load, stress. American life is much more stressful. And there's the work that was done by Liz Epple and Elizabeth Blackburn, who was one of the Nobel Prize winners, on telomeres, which are sort of the caps at the end that keep the chromosomes from unraveling. And there's something called telomerase, which is an enzyme that prevents the shortening. When it shortens too far, the cells die. So one of the big findings was that for caregivers, there was a relationship between short telomeres and the length of caregiving, but really bad caregiving. This was caregiving of kids with serious genetic diseases. But then also so there was a time dose response, and when you looked at controls and caregivers, you also found that. And the low stress and the high stress was equivalent to 10 years of chromosomal aging. Telomere length predicts health span and longevity in these studies. There are disputes about how to measure it and which way to measure it, but this was the first time one could take stress down to a relatively cellular level. And so one of the hypotheses always is stress. It's difficult to measure, although when you compare US and UK, it doesn't show up as a big difference. Another big finding, just switching gears, is the importance of early childhood. Here's some study using the panel study of income dynamics showing the effect of good childhood health, which in retrospect, on earnings. And the total lifetime effect here is $381,000. Huge effect. And when you also put in health as the outcome, you get you still get a very large effect, which raises the issue of how much of it is all set by childhood. Clearly, there's a view that lifestyle is that one of the major determinants of health. Genetics is relatively modest, and so there's a lot of interest now on the science of behavior changes. Most educated people know we all know what we want to do. We want to stop smoking, lose weight, exercise more, save more, take our meds regularly. Most people never get started, or if they start, don't follow through. So we need a new science looking at the mechanisms of behavior change. Many of the interventions, if they work poorly, or they're very costly in terms of time and money. And we funded a large activity here looking at the behaviors, especially, I think, at what you might call discounting. And there's a huge gap between good intentions and action, and I think discounting is part of this, choosing quick, small rewards over bigger rewards later. Part of this also fits in with prospect theory developed by Kahneman and Tversky, and the notion of environmental nudges. And your Prime Minister's office has a group that's working on this and using these things perhaps more than we. Now, here's an example of an environmental nudge using 401ks are the contributory pensions. Most of the, as here, defined benefit pensions have gone way down and abandoned by companies, placing all of the emphasis on the worker. Signal to me how much time I've got left. The if you just have standard enrollment sign up, it takes a long time before people sign up. But if you have automatic enrollment with opt-out, the default, you get much wider pension participation. People actually like to be locked in. They like to put their money in a sort of a lockbox, so to speak, where they can't get it in, where it's automatic. So the question is, how do you find examples of this in health? This shows the same issue of going for immediate versus delayed rewards at a neural level in terms of neuroeconomics, a study done by McClure, Leibson, Lowenstein, and Cohen. Flipping through quickly, the spread of obesity, I think, by Christakis was, I think, got a lot of attention, that obesity spreads through networks, including people you don't know and have never met, influencing you through people you do know, which again is rediscovery of Durkheim and shows the need for sociology, although sociology is kind of not strong these days. This is a very depressing finding. The decline in cognition with age goes way down except for vocabulary. How do we increase it? We had a large randomized clinical trial of 2,800, found out that you could have an effect on individual memory, reasoning speed, but that it didn't transfer from one to the other, and so the transfer of training is a big issue. Very important in terms of adult learning. Can it take place, and among whom can it take place? So this was partially successful. On the other hand, it did decrease motor vehicle collision in older drivers, which is, and the effect has lasted for at least 5 years, and we're about to open the 10th year of that finding. That's an interesting area. Going back to the public pension incentives that I showed you, one of the really interesting findings, again using ELSA, HRS, and SHARE, was the finding that early retirement is related to cognitive decline. In countries where you've got early retirement, which is caused by the public pension system, so you've got a great instrument there, there's a much bigger decline in cognition between 50 to 54 and 60 to 64. Quite a striking thing. So it may be that you need 10,000 hours of training in a multifaceted environment. And we're doing something called the Experience Corps with low-income black volunteers teaching in inner-city schools to see whether that activity will improve cognition, functioning, and the pilot suggests that it might, and it does. Although what it is, we won't know. It may be the social engagement component. So getting to the end, the changing frontiers of longitudinal studies. I think before we were using performance measures, now it's time use, subjective well-being, collecting DNA, telomeres, etc. And we've collected DNA for the HRS, and it's being genotyped and will be released this August, we think. And I think the integration of genetic data and theory into social science could be a very big transformation, used as an instrument to unravel causality. And I think it might refine the molecular basis of behavioral phenotypes and change, in a sense, our models and concepts of behavior. And there's a big cross-education going on. Let me skip over that in terms of the serotonin transport gene. Just two more slides. There's been significant progress in understanding the stages of Alzheimer's and dementia, the late mild cognitive impairment, the early mild cognitive impairment, and the pre-symptomatic. There's a huge amyloid imaging activity going on with the collaborative that is now spread across many countries, using a substance discovered at Pittsburgh. They're beginning to, using different techniques, you can see different deterioration, some of which is preclinical, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges we still face. There have been new genes confirmed in at least 2 genome-wide association studies, other than ApoE, the ApoE 234 allele, and these are pointing to various pathways, but we still don't know what's cause and what's effect. I mean, is the amyloid the cause or the effect? So let me end there. I don't want to keep you from tea, although caloric, or dinner, although I must say caloric, there are two things that I don't like about aging. One, that caloric reduction is very effective, and the other is that, you know, high intensity exercise looks like it's one of the big magic bullets. So